Measuring economic growth. There are four main indicators that can be used to measure a country's economic performance: the rate of economic growth, the rate of inflation, the level of unemployment, and the state of the balance of payments. Governments use these indicators to monitor how the economy is doing. GDP is a measure of economic growth. Economic growth can be measured by the changes in national output over a period of time. The national output is all the goods and services produced by a country. Output can be measured in two ways: volume, that's by adding up the quantity of goods and services produced in 1 year, and secondly by value, calculating the value in terms of billions of pounds of all the goods and services produced in 1 year. National output is usually measured by value. This is called gross domestic product. GDP can also be calculated by adding up the total amount of national expenditure, that's aggregate demand, in a year, or by adding up the total amount of national income earned in a year. This means that in theory, national output equals national expenditure equals national income. I suggest you have a look at my circular flow of income notes regarding this. Economic growth is measured as a percentage. The rate of economic growth is the speed at which the national output grows over a period of time. Over the course of several years, the speed of the growth is not usually consistent. Here are a very few useful terms. So, long periods of high economic growth are often called booms. If there's a negative economic growth for 2 consecutive quarters, that's 2 3-month periods, this is called a recession. A long recession is often referred to as a slump. An economic depression is worse than a recession. It's a sustained economic downturn which lasts for a long period of time, for example, several years. So here's our formula now for the percentage rate of economic growth. And you can see that in front of you. So over a 1-year period, a country's GDP may increase or decrease. This simply measures the change in the amount of goods and services produced between 1 year and the next. The change in GDP can be shown in two ways: as a value in terms of billions of pounds, or as a percentage, hence the formula. Some GDP growth may be due to rising prices, i.e. inflation. Nominal GDP is the name given to a GDP figure that hasn't been adjusted for inflation. This figure is misleading. It will give the impression that GDP is higher than it actually is. Economists instead will remove the effects of inflation to find out what's called real GDP. For instance, a 4% increase in the nominal GDP during a period when inflation was 3% means real GDP only rose by 1%. The other 3% was simply due to rising prices. GDP per capita can indicate the standard of living in a country. GDP can be used to give an indication of a country's standard of living. This is done by dividing the national output by the country's population to get the national output per person, that is GDP per capita. The formula, total GDP divided by population size, is on the screen. In theory, the higher the GDP per capita, the higher the standard of living in the country. Economists also use the following indicators: gross national income, GNI, and gross national product, GNP. GNI is the GDP plus net income from abroad. This net income is any income earned by a country or investments and other assets owned abroad minus any income earned by foreigners or investments domestically. GNP is very similar to GNI. It's the total output of the citizens of a country, whether or not they're resident in that country. GNI and GNP per capita can also be used to compare living standards between different countries. They are calculated in a similar way to GDP per capita by dividing the total GNI or GNP by a country's population. I wouldn't worry too much about GNI and GNP. I would tend to focus on GDP. Let's move on to purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is used in comparisons of living standards. When GDP per capita, when using GDP per capita, that is to compare living standards in countries, we use different currencies. Therefore, the exchange rate may not reflect the true worth of two currencies. So comparing GDP per capita in this way may not give an accurate picture. To overcome this problem, comparisons are usually carried out using the principle of purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is the real value of an amount of money in terms of what you can actually buy with it. This can vary between countries. For example, in a less developed country like Malawi, $1 will buy more goods than in a more developed country like the UK. Using PPP in comparisons of countries' living standards involves adjusting the GDP per capita figures to take into account the differences in purchasing power in those countries, with the results usually expressed in US dollars. This makes for a more accurate and easier comparison. Using GDP to make comparisons has limitations. GDP and GDP per capita are used to compare the different performance and the standards of living in different countries. A high GDP would suggest a country's economic performance is strong, and a high GDP per capita suggests that a country's standard of living is high. Using the GDP and the GDP per capita to make comparisons between countries has limitations. There are several things that GDP and GDP per capita figures might not take into account. First, the extent of the hidden economy, economic activity that doesn't appear in official figures. For instance, informal economies, people working on the land, subsistence farming, just growing food to feed their families, not actually selling it at market. Or it may be housewives working at home. They are not recorded on official statistics, although they are looking after children, cleaning houses, their homes, and providing food. Public spending. Some governments provide more benefits, such as unemployment benefits or free healthcare, than others. For example, two countries might have similar GDP per capita figures, but one country might spend much more per person on providing benefits that improve the standard of living. The extent of income inequality. Two countries have similar GDP per capita, but the distribution of the income between rich and poor may be very different. Other differences in the standard of living between countries, such as the number of hours workers have to work per week, working conditions, the level of damage to the environment, and different spending needs. For example, cold countries spend more income on heating to achieve the same level of comfort that exists in warm countries. Finally, income numbers represents percentage changes. Index numbers are useful for making comparisons over a period of time. The first year is called the base year. The index number for this year is set at 100. Changes up or down are expressed as numbers above or below 100. For example, a 3% rise in GDP over 1 year would mean the index rose to 103 in year 2. A 2% fall in real GDP over 1 year would mean the index fell to 98 in year 2. An index number of 108 in year 4 means an 8% rise in the base year. A 5% rise in real GDP over a year would mean the index rises to 105. So you get the idea there. So thank you for listening on my video on measuring economic growth.